Samuel 14 and 15. Are you amazed that we just got him crowned king and now we're seeing him deposed, right? It's like quick. At the end of chapter 13, we're reminded that the Philistines were encamped at Michmash. This was in verse 23, I think. And we also learned that the Israelites were at a disadvantage because they didn't have swords or spears. Don't ask me what they had. I don't know. Sticks and bricks. I don't know. Verse 23 told us that the garrison of the Philistines, which is where they were camped out, went out to the passage at Michmash. And if you go home and look at a map, you'll notice that Michmash and Geba sit like this, and what's in between is a deep ravine, like a deep one, 200 to 300 feet deep. So there's no bridge, there's no roads, it's rock, okay? So that's where this sets the stage for our lesson today. So I'm going to read the first 3 verses in 14, and we'll go from there. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600, including Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of God, the priest of the Lord at Shiloh, wearing an ephod, and the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. So this kind of this is the setting and the characters and all of the setting for what's going to happen. So Jonathan and his armor bearer are out looking for Philistines, but we learn in verse 2 that Saul is camped out with 600 men around him. Some translations indicate that he was under a pomegranate tree. Others call it a pomegranate cave. Either way, he's taking it easy, surrounded by 600 soldiers, and he has plenty of pomegranates to eat. Compared to Jonathan, he's out there on his own with his armor bearer, okay? Question 5 also asks you about the priest and the ephod. So the high priest was the one that would wear the ephod. It was an apron type thing. It had stones in it. And there were stones within that ephod that were used to cast lots, the Urim and the Thummim. So I don't want to call them dice, but that's kind of the way we would associate them, okay? So only the high priest would wear this special apron. In verse 3, we learn about the priest. His name, Ahiah. He was the 4th generation from Eli. We remember our stories about Eli, the high priest. You remember that Eli's entire family line was rejected by God. That hasn't changed, ladies. It hasn't changed yet. He's wearing the clothes. He's walking the walk. He's talking the talk. But God has rejected that family. Still has. Jonathan and his armor bearer were planning to undertake a secret mission here. They're going to pass over to the garrison on the other side of this ravine that was mentioned in the previous chapter. Within the passes, within the ravine, there are 2 rocky crags on either side. So rocky and so formidable, they have names, Bozas and Sina. One face north and one face south. In between these 2 rocky crags, at the very bottom is what they call a wadi. It's a creek or a tributary of the Jordan River, okay? So it's not deep. It's not like they had to swim across, but it's not enough to have saved them if they fell. At least I wouldn't think so. Depends on the rainy season time. But these 2 steep, formidable vertical rocks were somewhere between 200 and 300 feet tall, still are. Basically as tall as a 20 to 30 foot building. Nearly impassable. I'm not certain if Jonathan and his armor bearer were experienced in rock climbing. But these rocks, if you've ever been to an indoor climbing place, these rocks were 4 to 6 times as tall as anything that's indoors. And there's no ropes, no helmets, no helpers, no little things to put your feet in. So verse 6 told us that Jonathan wanted to cross over this ravine to the garrison of the Philistines, and he trusted the Lord would work things out for them. He knew that nothing got in the way of the Lord making them successful, even if there was only two of them. Jonathan came up with a plan to cross over, show themselves. If the Philistines say, wait, we'll come over to you, then we'll take that as a sign not to engage them in battle. But if they say, yeah, come on over here, we'll take that as a sign that we know that God is giving them to us. Question 8 in your homework asks you a really interesting question. What signs are we looking for in our actions to determine whether our actions are a part of God's will? I couldn't help when I saw this. Y'all might appreciate this better than maybe some of the younger ladies, but I couldn't help but be reminded of the comedian Bill Engvall. I don't know if you've all heard him, but every time somebody did something foolish or stupid, he would say, here's your sign. Here's your sign. You know, ladies, if we're just hanging around waiting on a sign, we're not on the right track. We need to start out on our knees with our Bible in our hands. First, we have to ask him. You know, so many times we've seen the actions taken by the Israelites, and particularly Saul, without properly even asking the Lord, or doing things that are, or they were doing things that are totally counter to his, to obedience. You got to start there. You got to ask, and you got to be in obedience. If we run by the seat of our pants, which I'm good at, I can run good by the seat of my pants, we'd be lucky to be 50% right most of the time. We'd be lucky. So pray. Pray for open doors. Pray for his will. Pray for help to make decisions. Pray for him to close the doors if they need, that they should be shut if they need to. But sometimes, just like here with Jonathan and his armor bearer, sometimes you have to move forward in faith. It doesn't mean that you dive off hoping that he'll save you, but they took steps in that direction, right? Even when we're afraid, if he's put something in our heart and it's in compliance with his will, then we need to take those small steps of faith toward that direction. Hopefully, if it's the wrong direction, he'll shut us down before we get too far in that direction. He'll turn us around. Philippians 4, 6, and 7, probably my favorite verses about this kind of activity, is do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Got to start with prayer. Don't ask for signs. In verse 11, we learn that they showed themselves, and the Philistines mocked them, saying, look, they finally came out crawling from their hiding places. Come on up here. We'll show you a thing or two. We'll teach you a lesson. Question 9 asks if they were being taunted. Yes, they were being taunted. Most definitely. They were taunting God's people. Jonathan said, let's go. Let's go. That's what I need. The Lord has given them into our hands of Israel. So they climbed up on their hands and their feet, these rocky crags. Once they got to the top, the enemy fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer. It says that they killed 20 men in about what's equal to a 10 or 15 yard area. So if you ever watch a football game, you know that those white lines, they're 10 yards apart. It's like everybody on both teams crumpling in the middle of those two lines. That's what happened. Verse 15 indicates that panic broke out in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and the raiders were mercenaries, okay, hired guns, if you will. They trembled. And the earth quaked. God helped Jonathan with an earthquake here. The watchmen that are over in Saul's camp see the Philistines scattering, and he suspected that some Israelites had sent them running. He examined his troops and realized it was Jonathan and his servant they were missing. Verse 18, Saul asked the high priest to bring the ark of God to ask if it should go fight. Did you notice here that the text mentions the ark of God? It went with them at this time. Interesting that this has become a habit now, carrying this ark around again, especially since they've lost it in the past. But when Saul saw all the interruption going on in the Philistine camp, increasing more and more, he told the priest, never mind, I know, we got it. We're good. He evidently concluded that he didn't need to talk to the Lord for guidance or blessing. It appears that, to me, when the way Saul operates is when he should have been doing something, he was notoriously waiting. And when he should have been waiting, he was notoriously acting. He just had them kind of reversed. God caused such confusion in the Philistine camp. They began to fight each other. Now, this makes me think they didn't have uniforms that could tell, the red from the blue or the white from the green or whatever it is, like you do in football. But anyway, some of the Israelites that had deserted from the Israelites and had been fighting with the Philistines came back to the Israelite camp and started fighting against the Philistines. And they all took sides and helped Jonathan. Even the Israelites who had hidden themselves in the rocks and the caves because they were afraid came out and joined the battle. And the Lord did save Israel on that day. But we learn in verse 24 that earlier in that same day, Saul had commanded his men to fast until they had defeated the Philistines. Actually, what he said was, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I am avenged of my enemies." We need to think about this. Were the Philistines Saul's enemy only? No, this was a holy war. These guys were in this together, right? The Philistines were God's enemy. And Saul displays here a very selfish desire for his own glory, which led him to make a foolish command over the soldiers. His oath that he put on them was serious because it was an oath of a king, and he could have them killed for not paying attention to that oath. Question 13 asks us why we think Saul would require the men to fight without eating. We don't know what the real answer is. The Bible doesn't tell us so. So what I would tell you is if you filled anything in that answer, you're right, because we don't know. I said in my workbook that maybe he wanted them to fast for him. That it was about him. It wasn't about them. I find him somewhat of a narcissist. He wants the admiration for himself. He wants the glory for himself. He made an order about himself and his victory over the enemy. They would be killed if they had not complied. In verse 26, we find that there's honey all over the ground in the forest. I really think this is a God thing. I truly do. He provided food, but the Bible doesn't tell us that. That's just a joy thing. The honey was dropping from the hives in the trees, but no one took them because of the oath. But we learned that Jonathan had not heard of his father's charge to the people with the oath. So he put the tip of his staff down there and ate the honey, and he said his eyes became bright. We also found out about the oath. When he found out about the oath, he said, his response was, "My father has troubled the land." I don't know. He couldn't say anything more plain than what Jonathan said. He has caused trouble for the people. We were asking question 15 what Jonathan pointed out about the oath. I believe he saw it was foolishness. Since he'd become more alert, he was able to fight when he tasted a little bit of honey. He felt like it would have been better for the people to have eaten freely, because at this point in the battle, they had not defeated very many people. The defeat had not been great. But as we're going to see, Jonathan was also ready to admit his guilt and die if necessary. Another point I want to make here is that his hunger, their hunger, did not condone disobedience, right? Being hungry, or hangry as they call it these days, is not an excuse for us to be rude or impatient or disobedient. As a matter of fact, there's no physical urge that you have that justifies sin, right? It's just not, your body can wait. Whatever it is, your body can wait. The battle continued, and the soldiers who were hungry and faint. Yet they struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon. Ladies, that's nearly 20 to 25 miles away. So how hungry would you be if you'd even walked 20 miles in one day? Hungry. So when they had finished, the people took the spoils from war and started to slaughter sheep, oxen, and calves, and were eating them immediately with the blood still in the meat, because they were so very hungry. The law forbade them from doing that. They at least had to drain the meat of the blood properly, and I would have wanted them to cook it a little bit, but that's me. When Saul heard about this, though, he heard about them sinning. He hastily set up a stone and gave them instructions to bring the animals here to slaughter and drain them properly on the stone, so they wouldn't be sinning. The sinful act of these people caused Saul to build his first altar to the Lord. Verse 36, we learn that Saul then decided to go to the Philistines at night and continue the fight against them, because they really hadn't won yet. But the priest suggested they ask God if they should go. Good question. When they inquired of God and asked if he would give victory, God didn't answer him. He evidently, Saul believed that someone had broken his rule, which, by the way, is not God's law. It was Saul's foolish curse, which actually caused them to break the law. Saul was certain that some sin had occurred that would cause the Lord not to answer. In verse 39, he makes another very foolish oath. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be Jonathan my son, he will surely die. No one answered. He put himself and Jonathan on one side and everyone else on the other, and asked God, O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is on me or Jonathan, my son, O Lord, God of Israel, give Urim. And if the guilt is on the people, give Thummim. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul asked to cast between himself and Jonathan was taken. Jonathan told his father at this point that he tasted honey off the tip of his staff. Even though he didn't know about the oath, he offered himself to be killed, even though he had been acting out of God's will and direction. Saul passed death sentence on Jonathan. The soldiers, however, refused to follow Saul's order. Wow. We just got to look at that. I can't say much about it other than this is insubordination, because they knew his rule was foolish as well. They said Jonathan had worked a great salvation in Israel. They would not allow him to be killed because he has worked with God this day. The people ransomed Jonathan. It seems Saul didn't see his role being under God's leadership, nor did he see the difference between God's law and his commandments. The whole incident kept them from winning a great victory over the Philistines. And it teaches a lesson that we need to be willing to be used by God, but certainly for God's gain, not our own. Strong distinction there. We get a little summary, verses 47 through 52, a summary of military conquests over several different enemies: Moab, Ammonites, Edom, king of Zobah, Philistines, Amalekites. And then a summary of his family. He had 3 sons: Jonathan, which we've heard about, Ishvi, Malchishua, it's the third one. He had 2 daughters, Merab and Michal. We will hear more about these daughters later. And then his wife, I've tried to pronounce this so many times. Ahinomah is his name of his wife. Don't quote me. Chapter 15 recounts God's final rejection of Saul. And it records a battle that Saul fought with the Amalekites. The Amalekites trace their ancestry all the way back to Esau. You remember the twins that were born, and Esau was the one that didn't get the blessing, and Jacob did. Esau's family is linked with the Edomites. They had been enemies with Israel since the time of Moses. Back in that day, God promised Moses and Joshua in Exodus 17 he would destroy the Amalekites. It's also promised in Deuteronomy 25 as God tells Israel that one day he will blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. They had come up behind the Israelites as they were wandering around in the wilderness and attacked them, savagely attacked them from the behind. They were sitting ducks. So God had promised that they would be punished for what they had done. Well, this is the day. There's no question that God's will was to totally destroy this enemy. While I totally understand that it seems somewhat cruel, God knew their hearts. And ladies, he has always and will always be a perfect judge. Okay? Even though it doesn't sound good to us, we have to trust God. It was the right thing to happen. In chapter 15, later on in the chapter, God sends Samuel to Saul, and this verse reminds him of what Amalek did to Israel in the past. So he reminded him of what was happening. And then Saul is to go and strike Amalek and devote them to destruction for all they did. And his instruction said, "Do not spare them, but kill both man and women and child and infant, ox and sheep and cattle and donkey." That's pretty clear. Frankly, this whole thing should have energized Saul to perfect action, knowing that this long-awaited, God-anointed promise is now in his hands to perform. How could he fail? How could he fail? If God promises, he delivers. How could he fail? Well, we find out. He started well. 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men from Judah. They came up to the city of Amalek and sent word to the Kenites to leave the city so that they would not be destroyed with the Amalekites. The Kenites were a group of people who were traced back in their ancestry from Midian. You remember after Abraham's wife Sarah died, he married another woman named Keturah, and the Kenites came from that marriage between Abraham and Keturah. And they've been allies with Israel ever since, but they lived with these Amalekites. I don't know if that was because of, I'm sure there's a reason, just don't know, didn't research that. Verse 7 indicates that Saul defeated the Amalekites, But verse 8 tells us that he took Agag the king alive. The king should have been put to death as well, because it was a part of God's command. His orders had been clear: kill everyone and everything. In verse 9, it says, "But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatted calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction." This is clearly not what the Lord required. They selected the parts of what God required for obedience and dropped the others. This convicted me too, because I'm guilty of this too. This type of partial obedience. I think we can all admit that often we select the things that we want to let go of while we cling really tightly to the things we don't want to let go of. In verse 10, we learn that the Lord has come to Samuel to tell of Saul's regrettable disobedience. God says that Saul has turned back from following him and has not performed his commandments. In question 25, we were asked about the word regret, why God regretted making Saul king. Ladies, God did not regret his very own sovereign action in making Saul king. He regretted Saul's personal actions, or in this case, his lack of action. Well, obviously, getting this news report from God angered Samuel. We learn that he cried out to the Lord all night long. Likely, he saw the consequences of what would be coming because of Saul's action. I think Samuel really cared about Saul. I think he wanted him to succeed, maybe for the sake of the people. Maybe he felt some degree of responsibility, but ultimately, he was still angry and he was lamenting over Saul's action. I love this example that Samuel gives us in this verse. He cried out to the Lord all night. Ladies, when we're angry, it's best we cry out to the Lord about it instead of railing on the person that we're mad at. You may still need to have that discussion at some point, but that anger's got to go somewhere. And the peace of God is the only thing that can diffuse that. All right? So if we let our heart go on God, he will eventually give us some peace in the situation, which is probably ultimately what we need. While Saul would finally admit his sin and likely be forgiven, the consequences of his sin wouldn't change. We were asking our homework question 27 to consider a time when our sins, while forgiven, didn't change the consequences for our sin. Unfortunately, I have probably too many stories to share about that, and I'm not sure I really want to share some of them. When I accepted Christ, I was 5 years old, and he forgave me. He forgave me of everything I had done and everything I would do, okay? But almost every sinful action that I've taken from then until now has come with consequences that I had to pay, or that somebody I love had to pay because of my action. God often brings us to the point of being sick over our own sin so that he can change us from the inside out. Some of the pits we dig for ourselves, we can overcome them. It may take time, it may take tears, it may take tribulation. Others, we have to live with until he takes us home. Samuel went in the morning to Gilgal because he was told that Saul had erected a monument to himself in Carmel. Now, I want a mini-series on this sentence. I want to hear about this, but we're not going to talk about it because there isn't one. But this guy went and built himself a monument. I hope that didn't get past you. Upon seeing Samuel, though, Saul, I performed the commandments of the Lord. Really? It's interesting that Saul was trying to claim that he'd obeyed God when he had only been partially obedient. I think he was hoping that Samuel didn't find out, or not thinking that God tattled on him, because that's what happened. I love Samuel's quick response in verse 14. But what's this noise I hear of the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen? Saul launched his defense by blaming the animal's salvation on the people because they planned to sacrifice them to the Lord. Well, always somebody else's fault, right? So let's look at 1 Samuel 15:16, that verse. I'm going to read a few of those verses. Samuel said to Saul, "Stop. I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night." And he said to him, "Speak." And Samuel said, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel." Got to stop there. You're king. Are you telling me you couldn't have controlled the actions of your soldiers? You told them not to eat. They didn't do that. Why would they not obey this? If he'd cared more about God's rules than his own rules, he may have been okay with this, but I digress. Verse 18. And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, "Go devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed." The reason that God asked him to do this is because in God's estimation, the Amalekites were habitually wicked people. He had promised to remove them from the planet, and Saul had no reason to do anything other than follow God's plan. In verse 9, he said, "Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and go and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord." Oh boy. "I have gone on the mission which the Lord sent me. I've brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction, but the people took the spoils, the sheep and the oxen, and the best things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice them to the Lord at Gilgal." But the people was his excuse. Saul was responsible for his people's actions. How often do we deflect responsibility for our own wrong actions, to try to justify our mistakes, to escape blame and punishment? Saul tried to use his action as an attempt to honor God. If you've ever had a 2-year-old, you've heard this, you've heard this, you've felt this, you've lived this. Because they know how to deflect blame and responsibility out of the womb, practically. As soon as they can talk, they know how to do it, right? Question 32 asks us, I got derailed. Verse 22 and 23 give us some really great insight into the mind of God. And question 32 asks us about those two verses. Obedience is listening, and listening is better than sacrifice. Remember, even the Old Testament sacrifices were to be completed on God's terms, by God's appointed person, and in God's appointed reasons and ways. God desires obedience over rituals. Question 33 challenged us to prioritize obedience over religious actions. The Lord desires our wholehearted devotion, shown through genuine obedience. He's not pleased with empty words and outward works and hollow actions. Our deeds should flow from true faithfulness and obedience, not replace them. We cannot make ourselves right with God by saying certain words or attending church services or even doing good deeds for others. True worship has to come out of surrender that's rooted in obedience. Further, he tells us that rebellion is like the sin of divination, and presumption is like iniquity and idolatry. Rebellion is opposition to established authority, against the government, against the police, against the president, against the governor, whoever it is. It's insubordination. That's rebellion. Presumption is when you take your own idea and turn it into truth. A lot of people do that these days. Have we not all fallen into some type of opposition against the authority in our lives? Our parents, our bosses, our government. If I had my mama back for 1 minute, I would just say, I'm so sorry for all the things I said to you and did to you when I was 15. Because anyway. I am so honestly also guilty of presumption. I believe in my mind that something is true and act out of that belief. And it results in, the bottom line is it results in my arrogance being put above others and my disrespect for them when I take my truth and try to push it on other people. Samuel tells Saul that because he's rejected the word of the Lord, that he has also rejected you from being king. Saul finally admits at this point that he sinned. Wow, it took a lot. He feared the people and obeyed their voice. And asked for pardon, and asked for Samuel to return with him, bow down before the Lord. He fails because of social anxiety. He fears the other people's opinions. Maybe because of his own insecurity, could be. Ladies, we can't ever put another person's opinions over the will of God. Justin taught us about that on Sunday morning when they said to the Sanhedrin, should we obey God or you, right? You have to obey God over other people. Samuel again declines to return with him. And at this point, Samuel turns away to walk away, and Saul grabs a hold of his robe and rips it. And I just see this thing in my mind of him just swirling around and saying, the Lord has turned the kingdom of Israel from you on this day and has given it to your neighbor, to a neighbor of yours who's better than you. I wonder how many times that videotape played in Saul's head in the future. And as we go through 1 Samuel, I think you'll come back and go, Joy, yeah, I think there really was a videotape of that he played over and over and over again every night, the way he acted. God didn't plan to change his mind, his plan. God always planned for David in Judah, a man after his own heart. God allowed Saul an opportunity to make a choice, but he held Saul responsible for those choices. Question 34 asks us why Saul may have admitted his sin, but still wanted Samuel to honor him in front of the elders and the people. It seems that the people's opinion, to me, was much more important to Saul than God's opinion of him. He wanted to maintain some control and receive some glory for his military actions. He wanted Samuel to honor him so that he wouldn't lose face with the people. Samuel did change his mind and agreed to return with Saul and bow down before the Lord. I'm not sure why he consented to do that, but I can tell you that it would have been a good thing to honor God with the people for the salvation that God had provided over the Amalekites. In verse 32, Samuel then called for Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and took responsibility for completing the request of God by executing Agag. You all read how. At this point, we learn that Samuel and Saul went their separate ways, and we learn that Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, and he was grieved over Saul. In closing, these passages really emphasize for us the criticality of our obedience. We're to be obedient to those in authority and to God. Our obedience should be complete, not partial, and based on our own opinions. Jonathan gave us a great example of his faith and his willingness to step forward in that faith. He trusted the Lord to save Israel by even as many as 2 people. Saul, on the other hand, lacked the courage to hold his people accountable to the Lord's command and was more focused on them keeping his own commands. Lack of obedience results in consequences. Sometimes those consequences last a lifetime. Y'all pray with me? Dearest Heavenly Father, please help us to use these passages as a remembrance of the importance of our obedience. While you died to complete our forgiveness and salvation, our obedience is more precious to you than any sacrifice. The sounds of our souls soaking in your word is precious in your sight. Remind us of our need to be obedient to you. Remind us of our need to be faithful to you. Remind us of our need to find complete agreement with your word and your will. Give us the strength to stand strong among our own presumption when it comes to obedience, to rely fully on your word and your will. Give us the courage to overcome our pride and to place our full trust in your word and your purpose. Empower us to confront our own self-reliance so that we may obey you wholeheartedly and depend fully on your word and your will. In the name of your precious Son, Jesus.